This video is proudly sponsored by me and the cool t-shirts that I had designed here at Merchland. Yeah, some of these are the worst day of my life, but the good news is every time you buy one of these $25 t-shirts, $9 goes back into my pocket and helps me recoup the cost I spent on legal fees defending myself from arguably the worst day of my life. Get one of these limited edition shirts before they are gone. So this weekend I was supposed to be up in St. Louis, Missouri, filming with my friend Jacob the Carpetbagger, doing travel content. And we had a family emergency, so I ended up having to stay here to take care of the dogs and to take care of my house. And that kind of sucks, but it got me thinking about my own family. And I was on the phone with Jacob last night telling stories about my family, and I realized I've told a lot of stories about my mom, my dad, even my brother and my sister. I've never really talked about the biggest character in my family, and that was my mom's dad, Daddy Carl, my grandfather, who was, to put it lightly, problematic. And I don't mean like Dave Chappelle problematic. I mean like sincerely problematic. Now, to be fair, he was born in 1911, died in 1993. He was 82 years old when he passed. Most of the stories I'm going to tell you about, he was already well into his 60s and 70s. Being born in 1911, he was definitely a product of his time. And then he grew up in the hills of Kentucky and Virginia, and he was a coal miner. There's certain things you can expect to come as baggage with that kind of life. In fact, I was thinking about the incident that I got charged with and the legal problems I had, and I realized I am very much my grandfather's son, because that's the kind of stuff he would do. He was always feuding with somebody. He was always shooting his guns in the air. He was always threatening people with guns, and a lot of the stories I'm about to tell you are going to involve all of that. But it made me realize the apple did not fall very far from the tree, even though I'm more of a watermelon. So to tell any of these stories, I have to refer to him as Daddy Carl because that was his name. His name was actually Carl, but my dad's name was also Carl. And then my dad had a cousin named Carl. There are a lot of coal miners named Carl, apparently. But in order to differentiate, we called my grandfather Daddy Carl and my dad Carl, even though he was the dad. It doesn't make any sense. I don't understand. He was Daddy Carl, though. Now I'm going to tell these stories in an order of levity, so they're going to get darker and darker as we go. If you really want the dark stuff, stick around, because it gets dark. For example, the way this man would feud with his neighbors. The small house that you saw that I left abandoned in Southwest Virginia, that house was where my grandfather lived when he moved to Virginia. He decided he hated his next door neighbors, though, the ones that lived across the creek. And because he was sick of them, he decided to make their lives unbearable because they had to drive basically across his property to get to their house. And the way I've heard the story told, it involved guns, it involved loud noises, it involved harassment, but eventually those people sold their house to Daddy Carl at a rock bottom price. And to hear Daddy Carl tell the story, these people were awful people, but I don't know. Daddy Carl, you weren't so great yourself. Earlier I said he was problematic, and the reason I say this is because he was openly racist. I mean, he would see a person of color in a store and then mutter things under his breath about how that store was going to shit because people of color were living and shopping in that area. So as you can imagine, he did not take it very well when the very first girl I ever dated was African American, and we dated from the age of 16 all the way well into our adulthoods. Maybe that's what killed him in 93, I'm not sure. But as someone who was raised on 1980s television and movies, I was fairly liberal, especially compared to my grandfather, and that always clashed when I had to spend time with my grandfather. And I would tend to speak up and say, like, Daddy Carl, I don't feel like the thing you're saying or the thing you're doing right now is cool. Perfect example, one day he was flipping through the cable channels, and keep in mind, he paid for the good stuff, so he had all 13 cable channels back then in the 80s, including HBO. And he used his clicker to flip all the way through the television, got back to the beginning, flipped through them a second time, then turned it off and slammed the remote down out of frustration. So, Daddy Carl, what's the problem? And he says, I pay for all 13 channels. And every single damn one of them either has a Jewish person or a black person on it. And he did not use the polite words that I just used. He loved to use derogatory racial terms all the time, the N-word being his favorite. And I feel like when my presence was around, he was excited to use it, found any excuse to use it, which is weird because the guy was really conservative. In fact, he would record movies from the television, but he wouldn't record the HBO version. He would record the Turner Broadcasting System version because, in his mind, those movies were better. I remember one day he put a VCR tape in to watch Death Wish with Pierce Bronson, and he had the TBS version. I said, Daddy Carl, wasn't the movie just on HBO? He says, yeah, but this version's better. They took out all the swearing and all the cursing and all the blood and guts and all the nudity. That's the point of Death Wish, by the way. If you've never seen that movie, the entire point is how bloody, gory, and offensive it is. As a little side note, that man was fascinated with his VCR. He had a huge collection of like 1,000 tapes where he just taped everything that he loved. All of his favorite old movies growing up, he had them on a VHS tape, and he watched them. He didn't buy them. He's not going to buy them. But when it finally comes on Turner, he's going to record it. And one day when I was a little bit older, I confronted Daddy Carl on his racism. And he said to me, I can't be racist. You don't know what you're talking about. You know, I once saved an N-word's life. And that statement itself is extremely racist. But I was intrigued. So to tell you the story, I would have to use the N-word, and I don't like saying the N-word. I don't even like saying, I would never actually say the word, but I don't even like abbreviating it. So whenever Daddy Carl would have used the N-word in the story, I'm just going to pretend this guy's name was Jeff, and I'm going to say Jeff, okay? Don't get confused, but I don't even feel comfortable abbreviating that word. So Daddy Carl says, when I was a young man, I was tending my daddy's bar first thing in the morning, and the men are coming off the night shift, and they want to play some pool and drink before they go to bed. And I look at the front door, and in walks this Jeff like he owns the place. Walks right down at the bar like he belongs there. And my thought was, how does he even get here? How did he get to this bar? How the hell did he even get to this county? He had to walk through 4 or 5 all-white counties just to get here. I'm surprised this Jeff is alive. So that's when I noticed that the men in the back have also realized that Jeff is in the bar. So I did the only thing I could think to do, which is save this man's life. I reached under the bar, I grabbed my granddaddy's shotgun, and I put that gun in this Jeff's face. And I said, boy, what you doing here? So this Jeff says, sir, I just want a drink. And I informed this Jeff that he was risking his life for this drink. And he says, yes, sir, I know. But you know what I did? I set down my shotgun, I popped the top up of a bottle of beer, and I set it down in front of that Jeff. And that's when I noticed the men in the back were making their way up. So I picked my shotgun back up, and I put it back in that Jeff's face, and I said, boys, I got this covered. Why don't y'all go back to playing pool? So I turned back to the Jeff and I explained to him that he better drink that drink real quick, and as soon as he was done, he better put his feet on the ground and start running and keep running till he got out of this county, or else those men in the back planned to do him harm. And he did. That Jeff picked up his drink, and while his hands was shaking, he gulped it down, he finished his beer, and then just walked right out the door, and as soon as his feet hit the concrete, he started running. And that's when I realized the boys in the back were starting towards the front door, so I turned my shotgun towards them, and I said, boys, would you rather catch a little bit of buckshot? Or would you rather go ahead and drink a free beer on me and finish your game of pool? What you thinking? Well, they chose the beer. So see, I can't be racist, Stephen. I saved their lives. So this would have been the 1920s, and I would go so far as to say for 1920s Kentucky, that was pretty progressive. I got to give it to Daddy Carl. But the problem is, when he's telling me the story, it's not 1920s. It's the 1980s, and the late 1980s at that. So times have changed, and Daddy Carl has failed to change with them. But that's something I've noticed as I grow old. Like, the ideas that I had that were progressive when I was a kid can be very regressive now. They can be very conservative now. I've always considered myself progressive, but I know that the world has changed around me, and sometimes the things that have changed confuse and upset me. I don't even understand them or why they're better. I just know that people think they are better, and I just try to play along. But Daddy Carl didn't feel the need to really play along. He kind of stuck to his guns. Now, when my mom and dad got married, they moved out of the area and moved to Cincinnati, Ohio to start a new life. But there, Dad was drinking real heavy, and Dad was apparently abusive to Mom, and eventually Mom caught pregnant, that's how she said it, caught pregnant with my oldest brother, Brian, And one day, Dad came home and kicked her in the stomach while he was drunk, and that caused Mom to pack everything up and move back home with Daddy Carl. In fact, she stayed in that little house that I mentioned earlier, the one across the creek. And after a while, Daddy Carl decided he wasn't going to raise Brian or anybody else. He was done raising kids. So he did what made sense to him, which is pack up his shotgun, get in his Cadillac, and drive to Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, as he told me the story, he arrived at Dad's apartment there in Cincinnati and knocked on the door. And Dad opened the door, not expecting Daddy Carl, of course. And Daddy Carl picked up the shotgun and put it in my dad's face and says, "Hey, Carl." And my dad answered back, "Hey, Daddy Carl." He says, "I heard you were thinking of staying in town instead of coming home and raising your son, huh?" And he goes, "Well, I was planning to send money back home." And he says, "Well, Carl, I think instead you ought to come back home. What do you think? Or would you rather go ahead and eat a shotgun shell? Your call. Get in the car, or you can lie dead here. It's up to you." My dad said, "Well, let me grab my things." He says, "Don't worry. We got plenty of things back home. Just get in the car." I can imagine that was an awkward ride back home to Virginia. But saving the darkest story for last, let me tell you about the time that he threatened my life with that shotgun. And fortunately, it was over the phone. But it all came down in the summer of 1992, just before I turned 18. And my mom was doing her usual pugilistic sports of just hitting me in the face and balls for her entertainment values because she was frustrated that day. And I had a dissociative episode. I don't remember doing this. I didn't have a conscious thought to do it, but I grabbed her hands as they were coming down on the 5th, 6th, 20th blow. And she began to panic, and I began to panic because this was not a conscious choice. This is just something I did. In that moment, I realized that I was almost an adult. I was a good 5 inches taller than my mom. I weighed as much as she did, at about 300 pounds. In fact, I probably weighed more at that point. And I could stop her from hitting me if I wanted to. And clearly, I wanted to because I had. And she was screaming and crying, "Let me go, you're hurting me, you're hurting me." And I'm like, "Look, I think I'm bigger than you now. I would never hurt you. And I'm sorry if I'm accidentally hurting you, but I don't think you get to hit me anymore, okay? Like, I'm only here for another couple of months before I go to college. You're not going to get to hit me ever again, okay? I'm always going to stop you if you try. So please stop, okay?" I let go of her arms, and she immediately ran to the phone to call my grandfather and called him up and said, "Daddy, Daddy, my son's hitting me in the face. He's beating me. He's hurting me. He's gone crazy," which was actually a fairly common occurrence. I never raised a hand to her a single time in my life, but that's something she would say all the time. I never understood why. She made me get on the phone, and Daddy Carl explained to me, well, I'll do his voice and explain it the way he did it. He said, "What the hell did you do? Did you hit your mama?" And I said, "No, Daddy Carl, I caught her hands when she was trying to hit me because I don't want to get hit anymore." And he goes, "It's her right to hit you. She made you. She brought you into this world, and she can take you out if she wants to. And if she tries and you don't let her, I'll come down there and I'll end you with my shotgun, you son of a bitch." I always took amusement at the fact that he would call me a son of a bitch because I think he knew my mom was a bitch. But but I said, "Okay, Daddy Carl, I promise you, if that's what happens, that's what happens." Now, I think my mom got the message because for the last couple of months that I was there before I went off to college, she would throw things at me. She would threaten me with weapons. She would threaten me with violence. She did not try to hit me. And thankfully, that meant Daddy Carl left his shotgun at home. So Daddy Carl passed in 1993 at the age of, I believe, 82. Does that sound right? I don't know. I'm bad at math. But just because me and him didn't have a good relationship doesn't mean he was an all bad person. You know, he owned a mine at one point. He employed people. He lived a rough life just like everybody else in my family growing up, you know. And he did the best he could by my family and by my mom. And honestly, he didn't do great. I do know he had a great relationship with my brother, and my brother loved him very, very much. And I'm so glad that they were close. And when Daddy Carl passed, I hadn't talked to him in a few years for obvious reasons, but at the same time, I did see how much he meant to my mom and how much he meant to my brother. And even though it didn't really hurt me that he was gone because I wasn't close to him, it hurt me to see how much it hurt the people I also loved. And it was kind of heartbreaking, you know? It's probably plenty of good stories out there. I'd have to call my brother and put him on a podcast one day and have him tell the good stories. And honestly, that's almost all the family stories I have left, except the family stories about my grandmother. But they all involve Alzheimer's disease, and I can't help but laugh when I tell them because of how awkward and awful they are. So I'm probably never going to tell those on YouTube. Catch a Twitch stream sometime, though, because I do tell them there. Now I'm going to go finish editing this video and upload it and wait to see if I get canceled for this video. Let's see if my YouTube channel gets deleted, because there are some dark stories in this. But I love these story times, and I love telling these types of stories to you, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Guys, as always, thanks for watching. I love you very much, and I will speak with you again soon. And if that young African-American man who my grandfather threatened all those years ago is still alive, you'd be 120, I think. But to him and his family, sorry that Daddy Carl sucks sometimes.